The highway stretched out before Marcus Williams like a ribbon of faded black under the glow of his headlights. 3 tours overseas had changed him in ways that only other veterans could understand. The uniform he wore bore the marks of his service, and the medals pinned to his chest told stories he rarely shared with anyone outside his unit. He was a Marine through and through, but tonight, he was just a man trying to get home to see his mother after 3 long years away from American soil. Pinewood, Virginia looked exactly the same as it had when he left. The same old diner sat on the corner of Main Street with its flickering neon sign. The same water tower rose above the tree line with the town name painted in blue letters that had faded over the decades. Everything was familiar, yet somehow felt distant, as if he was looking at his childhood through a window he could not quite reach through. Marcus had spent his formative years in this small town playing football at the local high school and helping his mother at the grocery store where she worked as a cashier. Those days felt like another lifetime now. It was nearly midnight when he saw the blue and red lights flash in his rearview mirror. Marcus felt his heart sink even though he knew he had done nothing wrong. He had been driving exactly at the speed limit and his car was in perfect condition, with all lights working properly. Still, the sight of those lights triggered something in him that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with experience. He had been pulled over before in his life, and those experiences had taught him to be cautious and deliberate in every movement he made. Marcus carefully pulled his car to the side of the road and put it in park. He placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible and waited. His military training kicked in automatically as he controlled his breathing and kept his mind focused on the present moment. Through his side mirror, he watched as 2 officers emerged from their patrol car and approached his vehicle with flashlights in hand. The beams of light swept across his back window and along the sides of his car as they moved closer. The officer on the driver's side tapped on the window with the back end of his flashlight. Marcus slowly lowered the window, keeping his hands visible at all times. The officer was a stocky man with a reddish face and a name tag that read Harris. His partner, who stood slightly behind him on the passenger side, was younger and thinner, with the name Bennett on his uniform. Both men wore expressions that seemed to carry judgment before any words were even spoken. Officer Harris shone his flashlight directly into Marcus's face, making him squint against the brightness. The officer looked him up and down, taking in the Marine uniform and the military bearing that Marcus could not hide even if he tried. There was something in the officer's eyes that Marcus recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had already decided what kind of person he was dealing with regardless of the facts in front of him. The officer asked for license and registration in a tone that carried no warmth or courtesy. Marcus responded with a crisp "Yes, sir," and explained that he would be reaching into his glove compartment to retrieve his documents. He moved slowly and deliberately, making sure every action was clear and predictable. His hands did not shake even though his mind was racing with memories of other encounters like this one. He handed over his military identification, along with his driver's license and vehicle registration. Officer Harris examined the documents with his flashlight, spending far more time looking at them than necessary. His partner Bennett walked around to the passenger side of the car and shone his light through the windows as if searching for something. Marcus kept his eyes forward and his hands on the wheel. He had learned long ago that sudden movements or showing frustration would only make situations like this worse. His Marine training had taught him discipline, but his life as a black man in America had taught him survival. The officer finally spoke, asking Marcus where he was coming from and where he was going. Marcus explained that he had just returned from overseas and was driving home to see his mother, who lived on the east side of town. Officer Harris asked what he was doing overseas, and Marcus explained his role as a K-9 handler in the Marines. He had worked with military dogs in combat zones, helping to detect explosives and protect his fellow soldiers. It was dangerous work that required trust between handler and animal, and Marcus had excelled at it, earning commendations for his service. Officer Bennett returned to the driver's side and the 2 officers exchanged glances. There was something in that silent communication that made Marcus uneasy. Officer Harris handed back the documents and told Marcus to step out of the vehicle. When Marcus asked if there was a problem, the officer simply repeated his command with more force in his voice. Marcus complied, knowing that resistance would only escalate the situation. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, keeping his movements controlled and non-threatening. The night air was cool against his skin after the warmth of the car. Marcus stood with his hands visible as Officer Harris told him to place his palms on the hood of the vehicle. The metal was cold under his hands and he could feel the engine heat slowly fading beneath the surface. Officer Bennett patted him down, checking his pockets and running hands along his sides and legs. Marcus stared straight ahead, focusing on a point in the distance and keeping his breathing steady. Officer Harris walked around Marcus's car, shining his light through the windows and examining the exterior. He asked if Marcus had anything illegal in the vehicle, and Marcus calmly stated that he did not. The officer asked if he would consent to a search, and Marcus politely declined, saying he did not consent to searches without probable cause. He knew his rights even if asserting them might anger the officers. Officer Harris stopped his inspection and turned to face Marcus with a smile that held no humor in it. The officer said they had ways of establishing probable cause, and that Marcus might want to reconsider his lack of cooperation. There was a threat in those words barely concealed beneath a veneer of official procedure. Marcus remained calm and repeated that he did not consent to any search. His voice was steady and respectful but firm. He had done nothing wrong, and he would not pretend otherwise just to make these officers feel more powerful. Officer Harris walked back to the patrol car and Marcus watched in the side mirror as the officer opened the back door. What happened next would change everything about this encounter in ways that none of them could have predicted. The sound of claws scratching against metal and a low whine came from the patrol car as Officer Harris opened the back door. Marcus kept his position against his own vehicle, but his trained ear immediately picked up on the sounds. He knew dogs well enough to recognize distress when he heard it. The animal in that patrol car was not eager or excited, but rather anxious and uncomfortable. That told Marcus something important about how the dog was being treated and handled. Officer Harris emerged with a large German Shepherd on a short leash. The dog was beautiful with the classic black and tan coloring and alert ears that swiveled toward every sound. But Marcus noticed immediately that the leash was too tight, and the officer was holding it in a way that put constant pressure on the dog's neck. The animal pulled slightly and Harris yanked hard on the leash, making the dog stumble. Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the sight, but he said nothing and kept his face neutral. Officer Bennett joined his partner and the two of them stood about 10 feet from Marcus with the dog between them. Harris spoke loudly, saying that their K9 unit Bruno was trained to detect drugs and other illegal substances. He made a point of mentioning that Bruno was very good at his job and rarely made mistakes. The implication was clear that if the dog alerted on Marcus's vehicle, then they would have their probable cause whether Marcus consented or not. Harris added in a tone that dripped with false casualness that Bruno could be aggressive with certain people. He said the dog had a nose for trouble and did not like individuals who were hiding something. Bennett laughed at that statement and added his own comment about how Bruno had strong instincts about people. The racial undertone in their words was not subtle. They were trying to scare Marcus into compliance by suggesting that their dog might attack him if things did not go their way. Marcus watched Bruno carefully as the officers spoke. The dog's body language told him everything he needed to know about the situation. Bruno's ears were back and his tail was low. He kept glancing up at Harris with uncertain eyes, as if trying to figure out what was expected of him. This was not a confident working dog. This was an animal that had been poorly trained and possibly mistreated. Marcus had worked with dozens of military dogs during his service, and he recognized the signs of an animal that did not trust its handler. Officer Harris walked Bruno closer to Marcus's car, pulling the leash tight and giving harsh commands. He told Bruno to search using a tone that was more angry than authoritative. The dog sniffed at the car's exterior, but his movements were hesitant and uncertain. Harris kept yanking the leash whenever Bruno did not move exactly as the officer wanted. Marcus could see the confusion in the animal's eyes. Bruno was trying to please his handler, but he was also clearly stressed by the rough treatment. The officers moved around the vehicle with Bruno making a show of the search. Harris kept up a running commentary about how thorough Bruno was, and how the dog never missed anything. Bennett added his own remarks directed at Marcus about how things would go easier if he just admitted to whatever he was hiding. Marcus said nothing in response. He had learned that speaking during moments like this often gave officers an excuse to escalate. His silence and calm demeanor were his best weapons right now. Bruno circled the car with his nose to the ground, but he showed no signs of alerting on anything. His tail remained low and his ears stayed back. Marcus could see that the dog was simply going through motions without any real purpose or training behind his actions. Officer Harris seemed to notice this too because his commands became harsher, and his yanks on the leash became more forceful. The officer was getting frustrated that his intimidation tactic was not producing the desired result. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. He had faced enemy fire overseas and had kept his cool under pressure that these officers could never imagine. He would not lose his composure now over their pathetic attempts to frighten him, but watching them mistreat Bruno bothered him more than their treatment of himself. Animals did not deserve to be used as tools for harassment and intimidation. They deserved respect and proper handling. Officer Bennett walked over to Marcus and stood uncomfortably close, invading his personal space in an obvious power play. The officer asked if Marcus was nervous and suggested that maybe he had a reason to be worried. Marcus looked straight ahead and calmly stated that he was not nervous because he had done nothing wrong. Bennett smirked and said that they would let Bruno decide that. The officer turned and called out to Harris, asking if Bruno had found anything yet. Harris responded with frustration in his voice, saying that Bruno was still checking. He pulled the dog closer to Marcus's driver's side door and commanded Bruno to alert. The dog looked up at his handler with confusion, clearly not understanding what was being asked. Marcus felt disgust at what he was witnessing. These officers were trying to make their dog give a false alert to justify an illegal search. It was corruption of the worst kind because it used an innocent animal as a tool for violating someone's rights. Bruno sniffed at the door, but showed no interest. Harris commanded him again, more forcefully this time. The dog sat down and looked up at the officer as if asking what he was supposed to do. Marcus could see that Bruno had not been trained properly for detection work. The dog did not understand the commands he was being given, and his handler did not have the skill or patience to work with him effectively. It was a sad situation all around. Officer Harris made a decision then that would prove to be a critical mistake. He yanked Bruno's leash hard and pulled the dog directly toward Marcus. The officer said in a loud voice that maybe Bruno should get a closer look at the suspect himself. The threat was obvious. They were going to use the dog to physically intimidate Marcus, or possibly even to justify using force against him. Harris walked Bruno right up to where Marcus stood with his hand still on the hood of his car. Bruno's nose came up and he sniffed the air near Marcus. The dog's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His ears came forward and his tail lifted slightly. Marcus could see recognition dawning in the animal's eyes. Bruno had caught a scent or picked up on something that changed his perception completely. The dog took another step forward, pulling against the leash, but this time not out of confusion or stress. This time Bruno was pulling toward Marcus with purpose and what looked almost like excitement. Officer Harris tried to pull the dog back, but Bruno resisted. The German shepherd's tail began to wag slowly at first and then with more enthusiasm. Marcus remained still, but he could not help the slight smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Bruno had recognized something about him that the officers could not see. The dog knew that Marcus was someone who understood animals and who had worked with dogs like him before. That recognition was about to change everything. Bruno pulled harder against the leash, trying to get closer to Marcus despite Officer Harris's attempts to restrain him. The dog's entire body language had transformed from the stressed and uncertain animal of moments before into something more focused and alert. His tail wagged with genuine enthusiasm now, and his eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that spoke of recognition rather than aggression. Marcus watched the dog carefully, noting every subtle shift in posture and every movement that told him what Bruno was thinking and feeling. Officer Harris yanked the leash back hard enough to make Bruno stumble, but the dog recovered quickly and continued straining toward Marcus. The officer's face flushed red with frustration and confusion. This was clearly not how things were supposed to go. Bennett stepped forward and asked what was wrong with the dog. Harris snapped back that he did not know, and commanded Bruno to heel using a harsh tone that showed his irritation. Bruno glanced back at his handler, but then immediately returned his attention to Marcus as if drawn by something the officer could not understand. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He slowly lifted one hand from the hood of his car, moving deliberately, so as not to startle the officers or give them an excuse to claim he was threatening them. He raised his hand to chest level and made a specific gesture with his fingers. It was a hand signal used universally by military K9 handlers around the world. The signal meant sit and stay. Marcus had used it hundreds of times with the dogs he had worked with overseas, and it was as natural to him as breathing. Bruno's response was immediate and unmistakable. The German Shepherd stopped pulling against the leash and sat down perfectly straight with his eyes still fixed on Marcus. His tail continued to wag, but his posture was one of attentive obedience. It was the stance of a working dog responding to a handler who knew exactly how to communicate with him. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that both officers stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Officer Harris stared at Marcus with suspicion and anger mixing in his expression. He demanded to know what Marcus had just done and accused him of trying to interfere with a police K9. Marcus kept his voice calm and respectful as he explained that he was a Marine K9 handler. With 3 tours of active duty experience, he had worked with military dogs in combat zones, and the hand signal he had just used was standard training that any properly trained K9 would recognize. Bruno had simply responded to a command given by someone who knew how to properly communicate with working dogs. Bennett exchanged a look with Harris that contained equal parts confusion and frustration. The younger officer asked if Marcus was claiming to be some kind of dog expert. Marcus replied that he was not claiming anything but simply stating facts. He had extensive training and experience working with German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and other breeds used in military service. He knew how to read their body language and how to give commands that they would understand and respond to. Bruno's reaction proved that the dog recognized proper handling techniques when he encountered them. Officer Harris tried to regain control of the situation by pulling Bruno back and commanding him to search the vehicle again. But Bruno remained sitting exactly where Marcus's hand signal had told him to stay. The dog glanced at Harris but did not move from his position. The officer repeated his command more loudly and with more anger in his voice. Bruno's ears went back slightly, showing stress at the harsh tone, but he still did not move. The dog was caught between the poor training and rough treatment from his regular handler and the clear, confident commands he had just received from Marcus. Marcus spoke up again, keeping his tone professional and non-confrontational. He explained that Bruno was showing signs of stress and confusion, likely due to inconsistent training and handling. The dog did not understand what was being asked of him by Officer Harris because the commands were being given incorrectly. Marcus suggested that if the officers wanted Bruno to perform a proper search, they needed to use the correct hand signals and voice commands along with positive reinforcement rather than harsh corrections. And yanking on the leash, Officer Bennett's face darkened at Marcus's words. He stepped closer and told Marcus to keep his mouth shut about things he did not understand. Marcus remained calm and pointed out that he clearly did understand given Bruno's response to his command. He had worked with military canines in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and he knew proper handling techniques when he saw them. What he had witnessed tonight was not proper handling. It was rough treatment of an animal who deserved better from the people responsible for his care and training. Harris pulled hard on Bruno's leash, trying to force the dog to stand and move. Bruno resisted for a moment and then reluctantly got to his feet. But instead of moving away from Marcus as the officer intended, the dog immediately tried to move closer again. His tail wagged and his body language remained friendly and engaged. It was obvious to anyone watching that Bruno saw Marcus as someone trustworthy and familiar in terms of how he carried himself and how he understood dogs. The animal's instincts were telling him that this man in the Marine uniform was safe and knowledgeable. Officer Harris commanded Bruno to alert on Marcus's vehicle using a firm voice and pointing at the car door. Bruno looked at the car and then back at Marcus and then up at his handler. The dog's confusion was evident in every line of his body. He did not understand what Harris wanted because there was nothing to alert on. Marcus's vehicle contained no drugs or illegal substances, and Bruno's nose told him that clearly. The dog could not give an alert that would be false to his own senses no matter how much his handler commanded. Marcus watched the scene unfold with a mixture of professional interest and personal concern for the dog's welfare. He could see that Bruno was stressed by the conflicting signals he was receiving and by the rough treatment from Officer Harris. The dog was trying to please his handler, but he was also responding to Marcus's presence and to the proper handling techniques that Marcus represented. It was a conflict that the animal should never have been put in, and it spoke poorly of how the Pinewood Police Department trained and managed its K9 units. Officer Bennett tried a different approach. He asked Marcus if he would be willing to give Bruno a command to search the vehicle. The younger officer suggested that if Marcus was such an expert handler, then surely he could get the dog to do what they wanted. It was a trap, of course. If Marcus commanded Bruno to search and the dog did not find anything, then the officers would claim he had somehow interfered with their investigation. But if he refused, then they would accuse him of obstructing their work. Marcus declined, politely explaining that Bruno was not his dog to command, and that he would not interfere with an official police canine. However, he added that if they wanted the dog to perform properly, they should consider getting him better, training and treating him with more respect. Working dogs responded best to handlers who understood them and worked with them as partners rather than using them as tools for intimidation. His words were calm and factual, but they carried an implicit criticism that both officers clearly understood and resented. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with the officers trying to force Bruno to give them the probable because they wanted and the dog refusing to comply. But at that moment, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance coming down the road toward them. A car slowed as it approached the scene, taking in the sight of Marcus standing beside his vehicle with 2 police officers and a German shepherd. The driver seemed to hesitate and then pulled over to the side of the road about 30 feet away. The driver's door opened and someone stepped out holding up a cell phone pointed in their direction. Everything was about to change again. The woman who stepped out of the car was middle-aged with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. She held her cell phone up high, making it obvious that she was recording the scene. Her voice carried clearly across the distance as she called out, asking what was going on and why these officers were harassing someone on the side of the road at midnight. Officer Bennett immediately turned toward her and told her to move along and mind her own business. The woman did not move. She stated loudly that as a citizen and taxpayer, she had every right to observe and record police conducting their duties in public. Officer Harris glared at the woman but quickly tried to compose his face into something more professional. The presence of a witness with a camera changed the dynamic of the situation completely. Marcus noticed the shift in the officer's demeanor immediately. They could no longer rely on it being their word against his if something went wrong. Whatever happened next would be captured on video and potentially shared with the world. That thought seemed to make both officers very uncomfortable, judging by the way they exchanged nervous glances. Bruno remained sitting near, Marcus still showing no signs of aggression or detection, despite being in close proximity to the Marine. The dog's tail wagged occasionally and his ears swiveled between Marcus and his handlers, as if he was trying to understand the tension in the air. Marcus slowly lowered his other hand from the hood of his car and stood in a relaxed but attentive posture. He kept his movements calm and non-threatening, knowing that the camera was recording everything and wanting to make sure his behavior could not be misconstrued. "Officer?" Bennett walked a few steps toward the woman and told her again that she needed to leave the area. The woman, whose name was Linda, responded that she was on a public road and had every right to be there. She added that she owned the convenience store on Main Street and had lived in Pinewood for 30 years. She knew her rights and she was not going anywhere until she was sure this Marine was being treated fairly and legally. Her voice had the firm quality of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before and was not easily intimidated. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who had stopped to help him. Linda did not know him and had no obligation to get involved, but she had seen something that concerned her and had chosen to act on that concern. It was the kind of community solidarity that Marcus had hoped still existed in his hometown, but had not been sure he would find after his years away. Her presence gave him hope that not everyone in Pinewood would stand by while injustice occurred in plain sight. "Officer?" Harris turned his attention back to Bruno and tried once more to get the dog to alert on Marcus's vehicle. He commanded Bruno to search using both hand signals and voice commands, but his technique was sloppy and inconsistent. Bruno looked at the car and sniffed in its direction but showed absolutely no interest in alerting. The dog then turned his attention back to Marcus and his tail wagged again. It was as if Bruno was asking Marcus for guidance on what he should do next. The dog clearly trusted the Marine more than he trusted his own handler. Marcus remained still, but he met Bruno's gaze calmly. He understood what the dog was feeling. Bruno was caught between poorly trained instincts and the natural response to someone who genuinely understood and respected working dogs. The animal's confusion was not his fault. It was the result of inadequate training and rough handling by officers who saw him as a tool rather than a partner. Marcus felt a deep sympathy for the German Shepherd and a growing anger at the officers who had failed him so completely. Another car slowed down as it passed the scene. This time the driver did not stop, but Marcus could see faces turned toward them illuminated by the interior lights as passengers looked out to see what was happening. Word would spread quickly in a small town like Pinewood. By morning, everyone would be talking about the late-night traffic stop and the Marine who had been pulled over by officers Harris and Bennett. Marcus wondered how the story would be told and whether people would believe his version of events or the officer's version. Officer Bennett seemed to realize that their window of opportunity was closing. He told Harris in a low voice that they should wrap this up. Harris nodded reluctantly and gave Bruno one final command to search. The dog went through the motions of sniffing around the car, but it was obvious to everyone watching, including Linda with her camera, that Bruno was not detecting anything. The German Shepherd completed his circuit of the vehicle and then sat down again, looking up at Marcus, as if waiting for the Marine to tell him what to do. Next, Officer Harris pulled on Bruno's leash and the dog reluctantly moved away from Marcus. The officer's face was red with frustration and barely contained anger. He clearly had not expected the traffic stop to go this way. His plan to intimidate Marcus into submission had failed spectacularly thanks to Bruno's refusal to cooperate and the arrival of a witness with a camera. Now Harris had to figure out how to end the encounter without looking like he had been conducting an illegal stop and search. Marcus decided to assert his rights clearly and on camera. He asked in a calm, respectful voice whether he was being detained or if he was free to go. Officer Bennett hesitated before responding that they were still conducting their investigation. Marcus asked what they were investigating since he had provided all requested documentation and had not violated any traffic laws. He pointed out that their K9 had not alerted on his vehicle, which meant they had no probable cause for a search. Therefore, there was no legal basis for detaining him any longer. Linda's voice called out from where she stood recording. She asked the officers the same question that Marcus had just posed. What exactly were they investigating and on what grounds were they detaining this Marine, who had clearly done nothing wrong? Her tone was sharp and challenging. She added that she was sending this video to her daughter who worked for a news station in Richmond. The officers would need to have a very good explanation for their actions because this was going to be seen by a lot of people. Officer Harris's jaw clenched and unclenched. He stared at Marcus with an expression that mixed anger, resentment, and something that might have been a trace of fear. The officer clearly wanted to assert his authority and put Marcus in his place. But the presence of the camera and the witness made that impossible without risking serious consequences. Harris was trapped by the very system he had tried to manipulate. His abuse of power had been caught on video, and now he had to decide how to proceed. Officer Bennett pulled his partner aside, and they spoke in low voices for a moment. Bruno sat near them with his ears back, showing stress at the tension in his handlers' voices. Marcus remained where he was patient and calm. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best action was no action at all. Let the situation unfold and let his opponents make their own mistakes. He had done nothing wrong and he had witnesses to prove it. The truth was on his side, and eventually truth had a way of winning, out even in difficult circumstances. After what felt like several minutes but was probably less than one, Officer Harris returned to where Marcus stood. The officer's voice was tight and controlled as he said that Marcus was free to go. There was no apology for the stop or for the way Marcus had been treated. There was no acknowledgement that the officers had overstepped their authority. Harris simply said that Marcus could leave and should drive carefully. But then he added in a lower voice meant only for Marcus to hear that Marcus should watch himself in this town. Things could get complicated for people who did not know their place. Marcus met the officer's eyes steadily. He nodded once and said he understood, but his tone made it clear that he understood far more than Harris intended. Marcus understood that he had just been threatened by a law enforcement officer. He understood that officers Harris and Bennett saw him as someone who needed to be intimidated and controlled. And he understood that this would not be the last time he encountered prejudice and hostility in his hometown, but he also understood that he would not be broken or scared away. He was a Marine and he had faced far worse than two small-town cops with inflated egos. Marcus walked calmly to his car door and got in. Bruno watched him go with ears forward and tail low. The dog whined softly as if sad to see Marcus leave. Marcus started his engine and carefully pulled back onto the road. In his rearview mirror, he could see Linda still recording, and the two officers standing beside their patrol car with Bruno between them. The scene grew smaller as Marcus drove away, but the memory of what had happened would stay with him for a long time to come. Marcus drove straight to his mother's house on the east side of Pinewood. The small two-bedroom home looked exactly as he remembered it, with the front porch light glowing yellow and the flower boxes his mother maintained beneath the windows. He sat in his car for a moment, letting the tension drain from his body before going inside. His mother, Gloria, would still be awake despite the late hour. She always waited up when she knew he was coming home, no matter how late it might be. Gloria opened the door before Marcus could knock. She was a small woman with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that saw everything. She took one look at her son's face and knew something had happened. Marcus tried to smile and downplay the incident, but his mother was not fooled. She pulled him inside and made him sit at the kitchen table, while she heated up the dinner she had kept warm for him. As he ate, Marcus told her about the traffic stop and about Officers Harris and Bennett and about Bruno the German Shepherd, who had refused to cooperate with their intimidation tactics. Gloria listened with the expression that cycled through worry, anger, and then fierce pride. She told Marcus that he had handled the situation exactly right, by staying calm and asserting his rights without giving the officers any excuse to escalate. But she also warned him that Harris and Bennett were known troublemakers in the community. They had a reputation for targeting young black men and making their lives difficult. Several families had complained to the police department over the years, but nothing had ever been done about it. The officers always claimed they were just doing their jobs, and the complaints were dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Marcus felt his anger rising as his mother spoke. He had served his country overseas, protecting the freedoms and rights of all Americans, including people like Harris and Bennett. Yet here in his own hometown, he was being treated like a criminal, simply because of the color of his skin. It was a bitter irony that was not lost on him. He had faced enemy combatants who wanted to kill him, but at least they had been honest about their hatred. These officers hid behind badges and claimed to serve justice while perpetuating the very injustice they were supposed to prevent. The next morning, Marcus woke to find his phone buzzing with notifications. Linda, the woman who had recorded the traffic stop, had uploaded the video to social media overnight. The footage showed everything from the moment Marcus had given Bruno the hand signal to the officer's frustration when the dog refused to alert on the vehicle. It showed Linda's arrival and her questions to the officers and Marcus calmly asserting his rights. The video had already been shared hundreds of times and comments were pouring in from people expressing outrage at how Marcus had been treated. Marcus watched the video on his phone, feeling strange about seeing himself from an outside perspective. He looked calm and professional in his Marine uniform, standing with quiet dignity, while the officers tried to intimidate him. Bruno's transformation from stressed animal to friendly responder was clearly visible, and Marcus could see why so many people were commenting on the dog's behavior. The German Shepherd had essentially vouched for Marcus's character in a way that no human testimony could match. Animals did not lie or pretend, and Bruno's genuine positive reaction to Marcus spoke volumes about who Marcus really was. By noon, the video had gone viral beyond just the local community. News outlets were picking it up and running stories about the Marine who had been racially profiled and the police dog who had refused to cooperate with his handler's intimidation tactics. Marcus's phone kept ringing with calls from reporters wanting interviews and from friends and former classmates reaching out to express their support. His mother fielded many of the calls, telling reporters that Marcus was not ready to make a statement, but that he appreciated the support from the community. Marcus drove into town to visit his old friend Danny Cooper, who ran an auto repair shop on the south side. Danny was working under the hood of a truck when Marcus arrived, but he immediately stopped what he was doing and came over to embrace his friend. The two men had grown up together, playing football and getting into the kind of harmless trouble that teenage boys found. Danny had stayed in Pinewood while Marcus joined the Marines, and their lives had taken very different paths, but the bond of childhood, friendship remained strong. Danny had already seen the video, and he told Marcus that everyone in town was talking about it. Opinion was divided, as Danny had expected it would be. Some people were outraged on Marcus's behalf and demanding that officers Harris and Bennett be held accountable. Others were defending the officers, saying they had just been doing their jobs and that Marcus must have done something to warrant being pulled over, even if it was not visible on the video. The divisions in the community were becoming clear, and Marcus was at the center of a storm he had not asked for. Marcus asked Danny about Harris and Bennett, wanting to know more about their history in the department. Danny's expression darkened as he shared what he knew. The two officers had been partners for about 5 years, and in that time there had been numerous complaints filed against them. Most of the complaints came from black residents of Pinewood, who claimed they had been stopped without cause or treated roughly during encounters. But the police chief, Raymond Peters, had always backed his officers, and the complaints had gone nowhere. Some people had tried to organize and demand change, but their efforts had fizzled out due to lack of support from the broader community. Danny told Marcus about his own experience with Officer Harris from 2 years earlier. Danny had been pulled over late at night coming home from a friend's house. Harris had accused him of driving erratically, even though Danny had not been drinking and had done nothing wrong. The officer had searched his car without permission and had become aggressive when Danny questioned whether the search was legal. Nothing had been found, but the experience had left Danny shaken and angry. He had filed a complaint, but had never heard anything back from the police department. Marcus listened to his friend's story with growing frustration. This was a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. Harris and Bennett had been abusing their authority for years and getting away with it, because the system protected them. The video Linda had taken was important because it provided concrete evidence that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. But Marcus wondered whether even video proof would be enough to bring about real change in a town where the power structure seemed invested in maintaining the status quo. That evening, Marcus received a call from Reverend Charles Morrison, who led the largest black church in Pinewood. The Reverend remembered Marcus from his youth when Gloria had brought him to services every Sunday. Reverend Morrison invited Marcus to come speak at the church that weekend, saying that the community needed to hear his story directly from him. The video had sparked conversations that had been long overdue, and the Reverend wanted to channel that energy into something constructive and positive. Marcus was not sure he wanted to become the face of a movement or a cause. He had simply been trying to drive home and see his mother, but he also understood that his experience represented something larger than just himself. It represented the experiences of countless other people who had been profiled and harassed and intimidated by those who were supposed to protect them. If sharing his story could help bring about change, then maybe it was his duty to speak up, just as it had been his duty to serve his country overseas. Another call came later that evening, this time from someone Marcus did not know. The woman identified herself as Katie Price and explained that she was a journalist with a regional newspaper. She had seen the video and wanted to interview Marcus for a story she was writing about racial profiling and police accountability. Marcus agreed to meet with her the next day, feeling that it was important to get his perspective out there before others tried to control the narrative. He wanted people to understand exactly what had happened and why it mattered. Marcus spent that night thinking about everything that had occurred since his return home. He had expected to enjoy a quiet reunion with his mother and to reconnect with old friends. Instead, he found himself at the center of a controversy that was forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths. Part of him wished he could just walk away and let things settle down. But another part of him, the part that had been shaped by his military service and his experiences overseas, knew that walking away was not an option. Sometimes standing up for what was right meant accepting conflict and controversy. Sometimes the easy path was not the right path. The next morning, Marcus met Katie Price at a coffee shop downtown. She was a young woman with sharp eyes and a notebook full of questions. She asked Marcus to walk her through every detail of the traffic stop, from the moment he saw the lights in his rearview mirror to the moment he drove away. Marcus told his story honestly and completely holding nothing back. He described the officer's behavior and Bruno's reactions and Linda's timely arrival with her camera. Katie took notes and asked follow-up questions that showed she understood the significance of what had happened. Katie told Marcus that she had already reached out to the police department for comment. Chief Peters had issued a brief statement saying that the article Katie Price wrote appeared in the regional newspaper 2 days later, with the headline Marine K9 Handler Racially Profiled by Local Police. The piece was detailed and fair, presenting Marcus's account alongside the police department's official statement. Katie had also tracked down Linda and interviewed her about what she witnessed that night. Linda described seeing the officers with their dog and sensing that something was wrong with how they were treating Marcus. She explained that her decision to stop and record had been instinctive, driven by a feeling that she needed to document what was happening. The article included expert commentary from a retired K9 trainer who reviewed the video and confirmed that Bruno's behavior indicated poor training and handling by his officers. The expert noted that the dog showed clear signs of stress and confusion when working with Harris, but had responded immediately to Marcus's proper hand signals. This suggested that Marcus had legitimate K9 handling experience and that Bruno recognized him as someone who understood working dogs. The expert also stated that Bruno's friendly reaction to Marcus contradicted any suggestion that Marcus posed a threat or was engaged in illegal activity. Response to the article was immediate and intense. Social media lit up with discussions about racial profiling, police accountability, and the treatment of working dogs. Many people expressed support for Marcus and called for officers Harris and Bennett to be suspended or fired. Others defended the police, claiming that the officers had simply been doing their jobs and that the whole incident was being blown out of proportion. The divisions in Pinewood that had always existed beneath the surface were now fully visible for everyone to see. Marcus's mother, Gloria, became worried about the attention the story was generating. She feared that making the officers look bad would result in retaliation against Marcus or even against her. Marcus understood her concerns, but he also felt that staying silent would only allow the problem to continue. If Harris and Bennett faced no consequences for their actions, then they would keep targeting people who could not fight back. Someone had to stand up and say that this behavior was unacceptable. Marcus had not asked to be that person, but circumstances had placed him in that position, and he would not shy away from it. Reverend Morrison organized a community meeting at his church to discuss the incident and what it meant for Pinewood. The church was packed with people from all backgrounds and ages. Some came to support Marcus, while others came to defend the police or simply to understand what was happening in their town. Marcus sat in the front row with his mother beside him, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on his back. The Reverend opened the meeting with a prayer for wisdom and understanding, and then invited people to share their thoughts and experiences. One by one, community members stood to speak. An elderly black man described being pulled over by Officer Harris 3 times in the past year, always late at night and always without clear cause. A young mother talked about how her teenage son was afraid to drive through certain parts of town because he knew he would likely be stopped and questioned. A white business owner argued that the police were just trying to keep the community safe and that people should cooperate rather than complain. A teacher spoke about the need for better training and oversight of law enforcement to prevent abuses of power. Marcus listened to each speaker, noting how the experiences of black residents painted a consistent picture of harassment and profiling, while white residents often seemed oblivious to or dismissive of these problems. It was the reality of living in 2 different Americas, even within the same small town. What seemed like isolated incidents to some people was a pattern of oppression to others. The gap between these perspectives felt enormous, and Marcus wondered how it could ever be bridged. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood and faced the crowd. He kept his voice calm and measured as he described what had happened during the traffic stop. He emphasized that he had done nothing wrong and had cooperated fully with the officers while also asserting his constitutional rights. He talked about Bruno and how the dog's behavior had revealed the truth about the situation more clearly than any words could. He explained that his training as a K9 handler gave him unique insight into what Bruno was experiencing and how poorly the dog was being treated by his handlers. Marcus also spoke about his military service and what it had taught him about duty, honor, and sacrifice. He said that he had fought overseas to protect American freedoms and values, and that it was deeply painful to come home and be treated as a threat in his own community. He was not asking for special treatment because of his service, but he was asking for basic respect and fair treatment that every citizen deserved, regardless of their race. The crowd listened in silence, and when Marcus finished speaking, several people stood to applaud. Not everyone was supportive. A middle-aged white man stood and accused Marcus of playing the race card and trying to destroy the reputations of good officers who were just doing their jobs. The man said that if Marcus had nothing to hide, then he should have just let the officers search his car, instead of making a big deal about his rights. This comment sparked angry responses from other attendees, and Reverend Morrison had to call for calm and remind everyone to speak respectfully even when they disagreed. Marcus responded to the criticism by pointing out that constitutional rights were not privileges to be exercised only when convenient. The Fourth Amendment protected all citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures regardless of race. He had done nothing to give the officers probable cause for a search, and Bruno's failure to alert confirmed that there was nothing illegal in his vehicle. Demanding that he surrender his rights to prove his innocence was exactly the kind of thinking that allowed racial profiling to continue. If people accepted that logic, then rights became meaningless. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours with passionate discussions about policing, race relations, and community safety. No easy solutions emerged, but at least people were talking openly about issues that had too long been ignored or dismissed. Reverend Morrison closed the meeting by announcing that he would be organizing a coalition to meet with Police Chief Peters and the town council to demand better training, accountability measures, and community oversight of the police department. Over the following days, Marcus received support from unexpected sources. Several white residents of Pinewood reached out to express their belief in him and their shame at how he had been treated. Some admitted that they had been unaware of the problems that black residents faced with local law enforcement. The video and the subsequent publicity had opened their eyes to a reality they had not seen or chosen not to see. While their newfound awareness did not erase years of injustice, it was at least a start toward greater understanding. Marcus also heard from other veterans who had experienced similar treatment despite their military service. They shared stories of being pulled over, questioned, and treated with suspicion, even while wearing their uniforms. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Service to the country did not protect people of color from racial profiling. If anything, some officers seemed to resent black veterans as if their military accomplishments challenged racist assumptions about who deserved respect and authority. Linda, the woman who had recorded the traffic stop, became an unlikely ally and friend. She visited Marcus at his mother's house and apologized for not doing more to help in the moment. Marcus assured her that she had done exactly what was needed by recording the encounter and being willing to speak out about what she witnessed. Linda explained that she had been raised to believe in fairness and justice, and seeing those values violated right in front of her had compelled her to act. She hoped that her small action might contribute to larger changes in how the community dealt with these issues. The police department's internal investigation proceeded slowly. Chief Peters announced that Officers Harris and Bennett had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. This was presented as a sign that the department was taking the matter seriously, but many in the community saw it as a delaying tactic. Administrative leave meant the officers were still being paid and would likely return to duty once the controversy died down. Real accountability would require stronger measures, but it was unclear whether the department or the town council had the will to impose them. Marcus met with a lawyer to discuss his options. The attorney believed that Marcus had grounds for a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and potentially against the police department for failing to adequately train and supervise its personnel. Such a lawsuit could take years to resolve and would keep Marcus tied to a painful experience he might prefer to put behind him. But the lawyer also pointed out that litigation might be the only way to force real institutional change. The choice was Marcus's to make, and it was not an easy one. Marcus thought about Bruno often during this time. He wondered how the dog was being treated now that the officers were on leave. Who was caring for Bruno, and was he being handled properly, or was he still suffering from poor training and rough treatment? Marcus had seen too many working dogs mistreated by handlers who did not understand or respect them. Bruno deserved better. 3 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, Marcus stood in the training yard behind the police station watching a young officer work with Bruno. Officer Nicole Price was in her mid-20s with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and an earnest expression that reminded Marcus of the young soldiers he had trained overseas. She had volunteered for the K-9 program after completing the new comprehensive training course that Marcus had helped design. Nicole had a natural patience with animals and a genuine desire to do the work right rather than using the dog as a tool for intimidation. Bruno responded to Nicole with enthusiasm that had grown steadily over the Past month since they had been paired together, the German Shepherd executed each command precisely sitting when told to sit and staying when told to stay. His tail wagged constantly and his eyes tracked Nicole's every movement with focused attention. This was a completely different animal from the stressed, confused dog that Marcus had first encountered on that roadside months ago. Proper training and respectful handling had transformed Bruno into the capable working dog he was always meant to be. Marcus called out a few suggestions as Nicole worked Bruno through a detection exercise. He had set up several boxes in the yard and hidden training aids in 2 of them. Bruno moved systematically from box to box using his nose to investigate each one. When he found the first training aid, he sat immediately and looked at Nicole, waiting for his reward. Nicole praised him warmly and gave him a treat. Bruno's tail wagged harder and he returned to his search with renewed energy. Minutes later, he located the second training aid and performed the same perfect alert. Marcus smiled with genuine pride at how far both the dog and his new handler had come. The investigation into Officers Harris and Bennett had concluded with results that satisfied some people and disappointed others. The county prosecutor had declined to file criminal charges, saying that, while the officers' behavior was inappropriate, it did not rise to the level of criminal conduct. However, the internal investigation had found multiple policy violations, including racial profiling, improper use of a K-9 unit, and making threats against a citizen. Both officers had been terminated from the Pinewood Police Department and barred from working in law enforcement in Virginia. It was not perfect justice, but it was more accountability than many victims of police misconduct ever received. Harris had left town shortly after his termination, reportedly taking a job in private security several states away. Bennett had remained in Pinewood but kept a low profile. Some members of the community still defended them, claiming they had been unfairly scapegoated to appease political correctness. But most people recognized that the officers had brought their troubles on themselves through their own actions. The video evidence had been too clear to deny or explain away. The reforms that followed the incident extended beyond just the K-9 program. Chief Peters had been forced to implement department-wide training on implicit bias and constitutional rights. A civilian oversight board had been created to review complaints against officers and ensure they were investigated properly. Body cameras had been purchased for all patrol officers, with policies requiring them to be activated during every public interaction. These changes would not solve every problem or prevent every injustice, but they were significant steps in the right direction. Marcus had become something of a local celebrity, though he tried to avoid that label. He had been invited to speak at schools and community organizations about his military service and about standing up for one's rights. Young people especially seemed to connect with his story, seeing in him an example of courage and dignity under pressure. Marcus was careful in these talks to emphasize that he was not special or heroic, but simply someone who had insisted on being treated with the respect that every person deserved. The consulting work with the police department had evolved into a more permanent arrangement. Marcus had been hired as the full-time K-9 program coordinator, responsible for training handlers and maintaining the dogs. It was satisfying work that allowed him to use his military skills in a civilian context. He had also begun developing a broader program to train service dogs for veterans dealing with PTSD and other combat-related issues. Several veterans in the region had already expressed interest, and Marcus hoped to expand the program significantly in the coming years. Gloria was proud of her son, though she still worried about him. She had seen how the stress of the past months had affected Marcus even as he maintained his outward composure. The traffic stop and everything that followed had forced him to relive painful experiences and confront ugly truths about his country and community. But she also saw him growing and finding purpose in ways that went beyond his military service. Marcus was building something meaningful in Pinewood and helping others in the process. Linda had become a good friend to Marcus and his mother, often stopping by to check on them or share a meal. She had been recognized by the state NAACP for her role in documenting the traffic stop and had used her platform to advocate for police reform and racial justice. Linda's convenience store had become a gathering place for community members who wanted to discuss local issues and organize for change. She told Marcus that stopping to record that night was one of the best decisions she had ever made, because it had opened her eyes to problems she had been privileged enough to ignore. Reverend Morrison's coalition had continued meeting regularly, working on various initiatives to improve police community relations, and address systemic racism in Pinewood. Marcus attended some meetings and appreciated the diverse group of people who were committed to making their town better. Progress was slow and there were setbacks along the way, but the coalition persisted. They had learned that change required sustained effort, not just momentary outrage. Danny had helped Marcus renovate a small building on the edge of town to serve as headquarters for the service dog training program. The space included indoor training areas, outdoor yards, and offices where Marcus could meet with veterans and their families. Danny had donated much of his time to the project and had recruited other local business owners to contribute materials and labor. It was a testament to how many people in Pinewood wanted to support positive change, even if they did not always agree on what that change should look like. On a sunny afternoon in early spring, Marcus brought Bruno to the training facility to show Nicole the progress on the renovations. Bruno bounded around the yard, exploring every corner with his nose to the ground. Nicole watched him with obvious affection, commenting on how different he seemed from the reports she had read about his behavior under Harris. Marcus explained that dogs like Bruno needed handlers who understood them and treated them as partners, rather than tools. When that relationship was right, both the handler and dog performed better and enjoyed their work more. Nicole asked Marcus about his plans for the future and whether he intended to stay in Pinewood long-term. Marcus admitted that he was still figuring that out. Part of him had considered leaving town and finding a fresh start somewhere that did not carry so much painful history. But another part of him felt rooted here, now connected to the community through the work he was doing and the relationships he was building. Pinewood had problems, but it also had good people who were trying to make things better. Maybe that was worth staying for. Bruno came trotting back to Marcus and sat at his feet, looking up with bright, intelligent eyes. Marcus scratched behind the dog's ears, and Bruno leaned into the touch with obvious contentment. It was a simple moment, but it represented something profound. This animal, who had once been used as a weapon of intimidation, was now thriving as a properly trained and cared for working dog. Bruno's transformation was proof that change was possible when people committed to doing things right. Nicole's radio crackled with a call, and she excused herself to respond. Marcus watched her go, noting the confidence in her movements and the way Bruno immediately oriented toward her, despite Marcus being right there. The bond between handler and dog was forming properly this time. Nicole would take good care of Bruno, and together they would serve the community well. Marcus felt satisfied knowing that he had played a role in making that possible. As the sun began to set, Marcus drove home thinking about everything that had happened since that night he had been pulled over. The traffic stop had been frightening and infuriating, but it had also opened doors and created opportunities he never would have anticipated. He had found purpose in training dogs and helping veterans. He had connected with people in his community who shared his values and wanted to work toward justice, and he had proven to himself that standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, could lead to meaningful change. Marcus thought about Bruno often and about what the dog had done that night simply by being himself. Animals had an honesty that humans often lacked. Bruno had not cared about Marcus's skin color or made assumptions based on prejudice. The dog had simply recognized someone who understood and respected him and had responded accordingly. That pure, honest reaction had cut through all the officer's attempts at intimidation and had revealed the truth for everyone to see. In many ways, Bruno had been the real hero of the story. A German shepherd who refused to cooperate. Chief Raymond Peters sat in his office staring at the stack of complaints and media inquiries that had piled up on his desk over the past week. The video of Marcus Williams's traffic stop had created a firestorm that threatened to consume his department and his reputation. Peters had been police chief in Pinewood for 15 years, and he prided himself on running a tight ship. Now that carefully maintained image was crumbling, because two of his officers had let their prejudices override their judgment, and someone had been there to record it. The internal investigation that Peters had promised was moving forward, but not in the way he had initially planned. His intention had been to conduct a quiet review that would find the officers had acted within policy and close the matter with minimal fuss. But the public attention and pressure from community leaders had forced him to bring in an outside investigator. The town council had insisted on it, and Peters had no choice but to comply. A retired state police captain named George Lambert had been hired to conduct an independent review of the incident. Lambert was thorough and professional in a way that made Peters nervous. The investigator interviewed Marcus at length, getting every detail of what had happened that night. He also interviewed Linda, who provided her eyewitness account and the full unedited video from her phone. Lambert spoke with officers Harris and Bennett separately, and Peters could tell from their faces afterward that the interviews had not gone well. The investigator was asking hard questions and not accepting vague answers or excuses. One aspect of the investigation that Peters had not anticipated was the evaluation of Bruno in the K-9 program. Lambert had brought in a canine behavior specialist named Dr. Helen Carter, who had extensive experience with police and military working dogs. Dr. Carter spent several hours observing Bruno and reviewing records of his training and deployment. Her findings were damning, and Peters knew they would reflect badly on the entire department, not just on Harris and Bennett. Dr. Carter's report stated that Bruno showed clear signs of chronic stress and inadequate training. The dog's responses during the traffic stop indicated confusion about what was expected of him and a lack of trust in his handlers. When Dr. Carter conducted her own evaluation, she found that Bruno responded well to proper handling techniques, but became anxious and uncertain when commands were given inconsistently or harshly. The specialist concluded that Bruno had the potential to be an excellent working dog, but had been failed by handlers who lacked the skill, patience, and temperament necessary for canine work. The report also noted Bruno's immediate, positive response to Marcus Williams and his correct execution of the hand signal Marcus had given. Dr. Carter stated that this response proved Marcus's claim about his K-9 handling experience and demonstrated that Bruno recognized proper professional handling when he encountered it. The dog's behavior during the stop had essentially vindicated Marcus and exposed the officer's lack of competence. For Peters, this was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the entire situation. A dog had undermined his officers more effectively than any human testimony could have. Lambert interviewed Sergeant Paul Fisher, who ran the K-9 program, and Fisher's testimony added another layer of problems. The sergeant admitted that Harris and Bennett had received minimal training before being assigned to work with Bruno. The department's K-9 program was underfunded and relied heavily on handlers learning through experience rather than formal instruction. Fisher had raised concerns about this approach in the past, but his requests for better funding and training resources had been denied. Now those chickens were coming home to roost. The investigator also looked into the history of complaints against Harris and Bennett. He found a pattern that even Peters could not deny or explain away. Over the past 5 years, the two officers had been involved in a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers. Complaint after complaint told similar stories of being stopped without clear cause, treated disrespectfully, and subjected to searches that yielded nothing. Most of these complaints had been dismissed by the department with minimal investigation. The pattern was obvious to anyone willing to look at it honestly. Peters called Harris and Bennett into his office to inform them of the investigation's preliminary findings. Both officers were defensive and angry. Harris insisted that they had done nothing wrong and that Marcus had been acting suspiciously, which was why they pulled him over. When Peters asked what specifically had been suspicious, Harris struggled to articulate a clear answer. He mentioned the late hour and the out-of-state plates, even though Marcus's plates were actually from Virginia. It became clear that Harris had no legitimate reason for the stop and had simply made a snap judgment based on seeing a black man driving through town. Bennett tried to shift blame onto Bruno, claiming that the dog had not been properly trained and that they had been set up to fail. While there was some truth to the training issues, Peters was not willing to let the officers off the hook entirely. They had chosen to use Bruno as an intimidation tactic rather than as a legitimate detection tool. They had handled the dog roughly and given inconsistent commands, and they had made threatening comments to Marcus that were captured clearly on the video. No amount of poor training excused that behavior. The investigation also revealed that Harris had made the veiled threat to Marcus at the end of the stop, telling him to watch himself in town. This threat, made on camera and in front of a witness, was a clear violation of policy and potentially a criminal act. Lambert recommended that Harris be charged with official misconduct and that both officers be terminated from the department. He also recommended a complete overhaul of the K-9 program, including removal of Bruno from active duty until he could be properly retrained with a suitable handler. Peters knew that Following these recommendations would be politically difficult. Harris and Bennett had supporters in the community who would see their termination as caving to outside pressure. The police union would fight any disciplinary action and might even file lawsuits on behalf of the officers. But Peters also knew that failing to act would be worse. The evidence was clear and the public was watching. If he protected Harris and Bennett now, his credibility and the department's credibility would be destroyed beyond repair. The town council met in special session to review Lambert's findings and recommendations. The meeting was open to the public and the chamber was packed with residents from across Pinewood. Marcus attended, sitting quietly in the back row with his mother beside him. He listened as Lambert presented his report in detail, leaving no doubt about what had occurred and why it was problematic. The investigator's calm, professional delivery made the facts all the more damning. Council members asked questions and Lambert answered each one thoroughly. When asked about Bruno's welfare, the investigator explained that the dog needed to be removed from active duty immediately and placed with someone who could provide proper care and retraining. He suggested that Marcus Williams would be an ideal candidate given his extensive canine handling experience and his obvious rapport with Bruno. This suggestion caused a stir in the chamber, with some people nodding in agreement and others shaking their heads in disbelief. Marcus was surprised to hear his name mentioned. He had offered to help evaluate Bruno, but he had not expected to be suggested as the dog's new handler. The idea appealed to him on several levels. He genuinely cared about Bruno's welfare and wanted to see the dog thrive. Taking responsibility for Bruno would also be a form of justice, turning a tool of intimidation into a symbol of positive change. But he also knew that accepting such a role would keep him deeply involved in Pinewood's problems and controversies for the foreseeable future. After hours of discussion, the town council voted to accept Lambert's recommendations with some modifications. Officers Harris and Bennett would be suspended without pay for 30 days, while the county prosecutor reviewed potential criminal charges. If charges were filed or if the internal investigation found additional policy violations, the officers would face termination. The K-9 program would undergo a complete review and restructuring with outside consultants brought in to develop proper training protocols. Bruno would be removed from active duty and placed in a rehabilitation program. Peters was directed to reach out to Marcus Williams and formally offer him a position as a consultant to help evaluate and restructure the K-9 program. If Marcus was willing, he would also be given the opportunity to work directly with Bruno to assess whether the dog could be successfully retrained for police work or whether he should be retired and placed in a different role. The council made clear that this was not a favor to Marcus, but rather recognition that his expertise could help the department avoid similar problems in the future. Marcus left the council meeting feeling a complex mix of emotions. He had achieved a measure of vindication and justice. The officers who had wronged him were facing consequences, and the systemic issues that had enabled their behavior were being addressed at least to some degree. But he also felt the weight of new responsibilities and the knowledge that real change would be slow and difficult. Structures of power and prejudice did not crumble overnight, no matter how clear the evidence of their failures.